evening. Tonight we are told to look at an interview, just an interview, but that is never how power reveals itself. Power speaks sideways through tone, through what is avoided, through what is suddenly said too loudly. When a chief of staff goes on record and delivers what many are calling a doozy, it is not entertainment, it is a signal. And when Merry Christmas is theatrically declared back, we should ask, back from where and for whose benefit? The interview as a window into power. Let us begin with the interview itself, not the headlines, not the viral clips, but the structure of what was said. We hear confidence bordering on defiance, certainty without accountability, and reassurance without evidence. This is not accidental. This is how modern political management works. Create the feeling of control even when systems beneath are strained. The chief of staff does not merely speak for a president. He speaks for an entire architecture of power designed to normalize chaos while branding it as strength. The doozy beneath the soundbite. Why does this interview matter? Because beneath the bravado lies a confession. When officials repeat that everything is working, they reveal anxiety that it may not be. When they frame criticism as hostility, they admit vulnerability. This so-called doozy is not shocking because it is bold. It is shocking because it exposes the gap between political messaging and material reality. Wages, healthcare, housing, and debt do not disappear because an official smiles confidently on camera. Merry Christmas is back, a cultural distraction. And then we hear it, Merry Christmas is back, a phrase designed to feel warm, familiar, even comforting. But understand this clearly, no holiday ever went anywhere. What went missing for millions was economic security. What disappeared was the promise that hard work would lead to stability. Cultural slogans are deployed when economic explanations fail. They cost nothing, divide easily, and distract efficiently. Why this became the best clip of 2025. So why are people calling this the best clip of 2025? Not because it clarifies, but because it crystallizes a moment. It shows us how politics is increasingly performed rather than practiced. It shows us how identity is emphasized when policy is thin. And it shows us unmistakably how media moments are engineered to replace democratic substance with theatrical certainty. The real question we must ask. The real question is not whether the interview was clever or whether the clip went viral. The question is this: who benefits from this performance? When attention is captured by slogans and interviews, it is diverted from budgets, contracts, deregulation, and power consolidation. This is not a conspiracy. It is a pattern, repeated across systems where wealth concentrates and accountability fades. What appeared on the surface to be a routine media appearance was, in reality, a carefully calibrated signal of power. In modern politics, interviews are no longer platforms for information. They are instruments of control. Every pause, every confident assertion, every dismissal of concern is designed to communicate something far more important than facts. The chief of staff did not sit for that interview to clarify policy. He appeared to reassure allies, intimidate critics, and project an image of command at a moment when uncertainty is growing beneath the surface. The most revealing aspect was not what was said, but how it was said. The tone was firm, unyielding, and deliberately dismissive of doubt. This is not accidental. When political systems feel stable, they can afford nuance and reflection. When they feel threatened, they rely on certainty. Absolute language becomes a substitute for evidence, and confidence is used as armor. The interview functioned as a public performance meant to stabilize perception, even if the underlying realities remain unresolved. This is how power now speaks to the public. Rather than engage in complex explanations, it simplifies. Rather than acknowledge contradictions, it reframes them as attacks. The Chief of Staff's role in that moment was not to inform citizens, but to manage belief. The message was unmistakable. Those in charge are in control, dissent is exaggerated, and concern itself is a form of disloyalty. Such messaging works not because it convinces everyone, but because it overwhelms the conversation with authority. The interview also revealed a deeper transformation in political communication. Governance has increasingly merged with branding. Officials no longer merely represent institutions, they embody them. When the Chief of Staff spoke, he became the symbol of order, regardless of whether order actually exists. This is powerful because symbols move faster than facts. A confident official can travel across screens and platforms in seconds, while the consequences of policy failures take years to surface. There is another layer worth noticing. Power does not announce weakness directly, it denies it loudly. The insistence that systems are functioning smoothly suggests an awareness that many citizens feel otherwise. Rising costs, institutional strain, and public mistrust form the backdrop against which such interviews occur. The louder the reassurance, the more urgent the need to provide it. This is not deception in the simple sense. It is perception management in a system that depends on continued legitimacy. What makes this moment especially significant is that it exposes how political authority now prioritizes narrative over reality. The interview was a message not to the public alone, but to markets, donors, party elites, and international observers. It said, stability remains, leadership is intact, and challenges are contained. Whether or not those claims withstand scrutiny is almost secondary. In a media-driven environment, perception itself becomes a form of power, and this interview was a deliberate exercise in asserting it. When political leaders insist repeatedly that everything is under control, it is rarely a sign of strength. It is a response to pressure. The interview's bold messaging, delivered with unwavering confidence, revealed a system attempting to silence its own doubts. The louder the certainty, the more visible the anxiety beneath it becomes. This is a familiar pattern in political history. Institutions under strain rely on forceful narratives to maintain the appearance of stability, even as contradictions multiply behind the scenes. What stood out was not the substance of the claims, but their frequency and tone. Assertions of success were offered without detailed evidence, and challenges were framed as exaggerations or hostile interpretations. This approach reflects a deeper fear that acknowledgement of complexity might weaken authority. In such moments, power chooses repetition over explanation. Saying something often enough becomes a substitute for proving it, and confidence becomes the currency used to buy public compliance. The gap between messaging and reality is where this anxiety becomes most visible. Citizens experience rising living costs, strained public services, and growing economic insecurity. Yet the official narrative speaks of progress, momentum, and victory. This dissonance is not accidental, it is managed. When leaders avoid addressing material conditions directly, they rely on language that feels reassuring rather than truthful. The interview demonstrated how political communication is used to smooth over fractures rather than confront them. There is also an institutional dimension to this anxiety. Political leadership today operates under constant scrutiny, rapid media cycles, and declining public trust. In such an environment, hesitation is perceived as weakness. The Chief of Staff's performance reflected an understanding that uncertainty cannot be shown, even when it exists. Admitting flaws risks loss of control, so denial becomes policy. This is not merely individual behavior, it is systemic, shaped by incentives that reward confidence over accuracy. The anxiety was further exposed through the framing of critics. Rather than engage with substantive concerns, dissent was cast as political hostility or media distortion. This strategy protects authority by redefining disagreement as illegitimacy. When institutions feel secure, they tolerate critique. When they feel threatened, they delegitimize it. The interview made this shift unmistakably clear, revealing an underlying fear that scrutiny might unravel carefully constructed narratives. What makes this moment particularly telling is that such messaging no longer aims to persuade skeptics. Its purpose is to reassure insiders and stabilize the base. The goal is containment, not conversion. By projecting certainty, leadership seeks to prevent doubt from spreading upward through political and economic hierarchies. This reveals a system aware of its fragility, working aggressively to manage perception before that fragility becomes visible. In this way, the interview did more than defend policy. It exposed the emotional state of power itself. Beneath the polished language and assertive tone lay a recognition that credibility is eroding. Bold messaging becomes necessary when trust weakens, and the insistence that all is well becomes, paradoxically, the clearest signal that it may not be. The declaration that Merry Christmas is back may have seemed light-hearted or symbolic, but it is emblematic of a broader strategy in contemporary political communication. Cultural slogans are used to distract from deeper economic and social challenges. In moments where policy solutions are thin or progress is contested, political messaging often turns to emotionally resonant symbols that can unite or energize a base, even if they address nothing tangible. The phrasing of this particular slogan is deliberate. It evokes nostalgia, tradition, and a sense of normalcy, all while diverting attention from material realities that citizens actually face. The mechanics of this distraction are subtle but powerful. A holiday greeting framed as a triumph becomes shorthand for a broader narrative of control and recovery. Citizens are invited to feel reassured, even celebrated, while systemic issues such as healthcare deficits, income inequality, or inflation remain largely unaddressed. The slogan operates as a psychological placeholder. It signals victory or restoration without requiring substantive policy change. The focus shifts from measurable outcomes to feelings of cultural validation, which are far easier to project, manage, and control. What makes this approach particularly effective is the way it reframes the public conversation. Complex issues such as the rising cost of living or challenges in social safety nets are abstract and difficult to communicate in a 30-second clip. Slogans, however, condense ideas into emotionally digestible sound bites. They tap into collective identity, tradition, and loyalty, creating a sense of achievement or return, even when the underlying conditions have barely changed. In this way, messaging becomes performative. Its purpose is not to solve problems, but to manage perception. The timing and delivery of such slogans amplify their impact. By coupling the phrase with a prominent interview, media coverage, or celebratory framing, officials transform cultural signals into viral moments. The slogan becomes a headline, a talking point, and a meme, circulating faster than any policy briefing or economic analysis could. This ensures that attention is captured and directed. diverting scrutiny from areas where public dissatisfaction is mounting. The emotional resonance often outweighs critical evaluation, creating a feedback loop in which symbolic gestures substitute for real solutions. At the same time, slogans like this illuminate priorities. The choice to emphasize cultural or symbolic victories over substantive policy achievements reveals where leadership believes energy is best spent, maintaining loyalty, controlling narratives, and signaling stability. The public is encouraged to invest in perception rather than outcomes. Economic frustrations, institutional failures, or policy gaps are rendered less visible, while the familiar and comforting imagery of cultural restoration dominates discourse. Ultimately, the slogan's power lies in its simplicity and emotional pull. It reassures, distracts, and unites simultaneously, serving as a strategic tool in a landscape where attention is finite and media cycles relentless. By focusing on what feels culturally significant, political actors manage expectations, shape public sentiment, and obscure the deeper structural challenges that remain unresolved, all while claiming progress and control. The designation of this interview as the best clip of 2025 reflects more than popularity. It illustrates a fundamental shift in modern political engagement where performance increasingly substitutes for substantive governance. In the contemporary media landscape, viral moments often carry more weight than detailed policy discussions. Political communication is no longer merely about informing the public or explaining decisions. It is about creating visually and emotionally compelling narratives that dominate attention. The clip's rapid circulation demonstrates how spectacle can overshadow content, transforming governance into a curated performance for mass consumption. The allure of such clips lies in their immediacy. In a media ecosystem dominated by social platforms and shortened attention spans, citizens are drawn to moments that are concise, dramatic, and emotionally charged. Detailed analysis, budget breakdowns, or legislative nuance cannot compete with a confident declaration or a visually striking segment. The Chief of Staff's interview, distilled into a short, shareable clip, exemplifies how authority is now mediated through imagery and sound bites, where perception often eclipses reality. Every pause, every gesture, every emphatic statement becomes a tool to assert dominance, regardless of whether the underlying policy succeeds. This transformation has implications beyond audience engagement. It reshapes the incentives of political actors themselves. Leaders are increasingly rewarded for moments that trend, generate debate, or dominate news cycles rather than for policy effectiveness. Media virality becomes a proxy for political success. In this context, the interview's prominence as a best clip signals that communication skill, charisma, and media strategy may hold as much, if not more, value than the actual governance it purports to explain. Performance and optics are elevated to tools of legitimacy, capable of masking weaknesses or deflecting criticism. The clip also underscores how identity, politics, and emotional resonance are prioritized over factual discourse. By emphasizing style, confidence, and symbolic messaging, the interview crafts a narrative that resonates with viewers on a visceral level. Emotional engagement is more immediate than analytical reasoning, and by capturing attention through performance, leaders can subtly shape public perception without addressing policy depth. Audiences are drawn to moments that feel decisive or entertaining, and the viral nature of such clips ensures that these impressions are reinforced repeatedly across platforms. Finally, this phenomenon highlights a broader trend in which political debate becomes performative theater. Policy discussions are compressed into digestible spectacles designed for maximal impact rather than careful deliberation. The best clip designation is therefore not merely about entertainment value. It reflects how political legitimacy is increasingly constructed through appearances. It reveals a system in which media strategy, narrative control, and public perception can at times outweigh legislative achievement or substantive reform, and where citizens' understanding of power is shaped as much by what they see and feel as by what actually transpires behind the scenes. The most striking element of the interview is not only what was said, but what was carefully left unsaid. In political communication, silence is as revealing as speech, and avoidance often signals the contours of real power. By sidestepping discussions on structural issues, economic inequality, or policy failures, the interview exposed the priorities of leadership, controlling narrative rather than addressing substance. In this sense, absence speaks volumes. The gaps in the conversation illuminate where attention is deliberately diverted, revealing the strategic calculus that underpins public messaging. Every omission functions as a signal. When topics such as healthcare, public debt, or institutional accountability are ignored, the public is guided to focus elsewhere, on slogans, performances, and emotionally resonant phrases. The Chief of Staff's confident delivery draws attention to selected narratives while leaving other critical areas invisible. This selective framing is a powerful tool because it shapes what the audience perceives as urgent or relevant, leaving the weightiest challenges obscured. By curating the conversation, leaders effectively dictate which questions are permissible and which are inconvenient. Avoidance also amplifies the stakes of what is presented. The more an official emphasizes certain points, the more the audience notices the absence of others. For example, confident assertions about order, control, or tradition implicitly highlight that systemic issues exist but are not being confronted directly. This strategy creates a dual effect. It reassures supporters while subtly signaling to critics that certain problems are being managed quietly, if at all. The tension between declaration and omission becomes a form of communication itself, revealing vulnerability behind polished messaging. The strategy of selective silence is reinforced by the surrounding media ecosystem. In an era dominated by short clips, social feeds, and rapid consumption, what is left unsaid is rarely scrutinized in real time. Headlines amplify statements while glossing over omissions, allowing leaders to present a curated version of reality. By directing attention toward emotionally resonant or culturally significant moments, leadership ensures that structural issues, long-term policy challenges, and systemic inequities remain secondary in public consciousness. This demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of attention economy and narrative control, in which absence is weaponized as effectively as speech. Moreover, the omissions in the interview reveal institutional self-preservation. Discussing challenges openly might trigger criticism, reduce confidence among supporters, or invite scrutiny from political opponents. By avoiding direct engagement with sensitive topics, leadership prioritizes stability over transparency. The message is clear: perception management takes precedence over full disclosure. The audience is invited to trust authority while remaining unaware of the deeper systemic issues that shape governance and societal outcomes. The power of what was avoided in this interview is thus as instructive as the spoken words. It exposes the subtle mechanisms through which authority navigates accountability, manages attention, and shapes public understanding. Every omission, every carefully navigated silence highlights the calculated design behind political communication, revealing a system in which what is not said often carries more weight than what is spoken aloud.